I want to go over the basics of Cold War. So the Cold War is called that because of the fact that the US and the USSR did not actually go to war with each other. Instead, what we see is a Cold War in which the two are always saying they're going to go to war with each other, but they never do fight with each other. Instead, what we see are either proxy wars, so we'll have two countries that are actually fighting, and the US will send troops to help one side, and the Russians will send troops to help one side, but they won't actually be fighting each other. Or we'll see the world being divided into spheres of influence, in which the US will try to influence certain countries, and the USSR will try to influence other ones. So that's why we call it a Cold War. Now, typically, when we talk about the Cold War, we say, oh, well, it's Russia versus the United States, it's communism versus capitalism. Well, what we call communism actually wasn't communism. Communism, as defined in the 1800s, was about making sure there was equality for all classes. It wasn't trying to do away with the idea of private property. It wasn't trying to create an authoritarian dictatorship, which is what Russia was and still is. Instead, communism was supposed to create a democracy. Unfortunately, when Russia becomes a so-called communistic country, it creates an authoritarian dictatorship that calls itself a communistic country. It's not actually communism, and I need to emphasize this. It's an authoritarian dictatorship. But we have to use the term communism because that's what everyone uses. Now, Russia in this time period had a lot of state control. So it had a state control economy, it had state control military. But what worried people the most was the idea of the state controlled economy. The idea that the Russian government could regulate the economy in a way people really were terrified of. Now, propaganda during the war said that this meant that the Russians did away with all private property and did away with the values of capitalism, market values. In reality, yes, it did do away with market values, but it never did away with private property. But US propaganda said that communism would do away with private property. And that got people really scared because they said, well, these are my things. What are you telling me I can't have my own things? So that was one major fear, this idea of economics. Another major fear was the idea of religion. During the Cold, when Russia becomes an authoritarian dictatorship, they say, well, under communism, you cannot have a state, you cannot have a religion. You have to be secular. And Russia really goes out of its way to persecute people who are religious. They persecute Jewish persons, they persecute all Christians, and this includes Catholics, so all Christians. And people in America are kind of terrified of this. They say, okay, well, if Russians are persecuting Christians, well, that's not what we believe in. Now, part of the reason that America reacts to the point that it does is because as Russia is going through its revolution in the late 19 teens, the US is going through a massive religious revival and is starting to emphasize more and more that it is a Christian nation, particularly a Protestant nation. So it starts to say, well, if Russia focuses on secularism and having no religion, then we are going to emphasize being a Christian nation. And so many of the values of the Cold War, much of the propaganda of the Cold War, focuses in on this idea that Russia is quote unquote godless, while the US is a godly society. It has a Christian value, particularly a Protestant value. Propaganda during the Cold War suggested that Russia was doing away with the family, and it suggested that women are being forced not to behave as women but to behave as men, that children were being taken away from their parents and were being raised by a committee or a state. that's just not true. It's it's completely 100% not true. The families were really highly prized in Russia. You were supposed to get married, you were supposed to have lots of children, you were supposed to send them to school and teach them how to be good Russians. Russia really actually promoted women. It wanted women to be active members in the economy and have active roles in daily life. Russian women are not allowed to be politicians, which is a major issue with this ideal. But Russian women were told, we need you to be actors in daily life. We want you to be. They're not really being forced to it. They're not being held at gunpoint, but they're being told your work is valuable to us. You should do what you think is best. And so we have more career women in Russia. The US sees this and says, well, that means that you don't value motherhood. Well, that's not true at all. Russian women actually were more second wave feminists than American women. So second wave feminism says you can do it all. You can have a career and you can raise your kids. And that's what Russian women were doing. But US propaganda said, oh, well, Russia's doing away with the family. Not true, but that's what many people believed during this period. So the US sees itself as the antithesis of Russia, as the opposite of Russia. And in many ways, the two of them were actually very, very similar. They ultimately, though, used propaganda to say the other was the demon. And propaganda was the main driving force of keeping the Cold War going for nearly 5 decades.